The wagon creaked into Windermere just past the hour when shadows leaned long across the dust. The sun sagged behind the chapel's steeple, casting a crooked cross over the auction pen. Paint flaked from the wood, and the banners, once bright, hung limp and gray with wind-blown earth. Inside the wagon, Clara Donnelly sat with gloved hands folded in her lap. Her fingers were blistered and still red from a harvest she hadn't finished 3 states ago. A thin veil, the color of ash and threadbare in places, draped over her hat and caught on a splinter. She did not pull it free. She did not look up. The wheels crunched to a stop beside the corral. Behind her, horses snorted and shifted, their ribs showing like ghosts beneath sun-dried skin. Ahead of her, a cluster of men leaned against posts and saddles, chewing tobacco and words in equal measure. They weren't there for livestock, not really. Everyone knew the horses were half broken, near useless. But the woman, she was another curiosity, something to jest about over whiskey and dust. She come with reins or a broomstick? One barked. She got a mouth to work or just for prayin'? Laughter. Boots scraped on boards. Clara stepped down slowly, her worn boots crunching on gravel. The shawl on her shoulders fluttered in the wind like a white flag too tired to stand. Her eyes did not search for pity, only a place to land quietly. She found none. The auctioneer, a stub-fingered man with a voice like torn canvas, climbed onto the makeshift platform. Right then, next we got one Mrs. Clara Donnelly, widowed, penniless, no kin, can sew, cook, and hold her tongue. A real prize for someone with low standards and a long winter. More laughter. She stood beside a sway-backed mare, tethered to the post, the horse's eyes almost as tired as hers. Clara did not flinch when a man with greasy hands lifted the edge of her shawl. She simply turned her head and looked past him, toward the ridgeline. Then a silence moved through the crowd, like a cold finger across the nape. A man had stepped forward. He wore a black hat, weathered pale at the brim, and his duster coat was stained with years of dust and ash. He was tall, built like a rail post but held together by something stronger than wood. His boots made no sound on the dirt. He raised one hand, just once, just enough. A quiet gesture, not a bid. A claim. The auctioneer hesitated, cleared his throat. "Mr. Vane, that your offer?" The man nodded once. He did not speak, hadn't in years. A few mutters passed among the men. Some stepped back. One spat in the dirt and said, "Figures." Clara looked at him then, not for mercy, not even for hope, just curiosity. His face bore old lines, not from smiling, but from surviving. His eyes, pale gray, not blue, held something she hadn't seen since before the war. Stillness. The auctioneer muttered something about silver. The man pulled 2 coins from his coat pocket and dropped them into a gloved hand. They made a sound like metal in a coffin. Clara was handed a small bundle of her things, a sewing kit, a cracked Bible, and a locket she'd once tried to pawn. She took them without expression. He turned, walked, and she followed. Not because she was told, but because for the first time in months, no one had asked her to kneel. The ride was silent. The wind tugged gently at her shawl, and she tightened it around her shoulders. Ahead, the man's horse trotted steady, unhurried. The dust from its hooves rose like smoke and caught in Clara's throat, but she didn't cough. She didn't want to disturb the silence. It felt sacred somehow, heavy with meaning. They passed broken fences, wind-carved stone, and rusted farm tools half swallowed by time. The sky bled orange, and then bruised to violet. No stars dared show just yet. When they reached the edge of the hills, the man dismounted and tied the reins to a cedar post. The cabin came into view slowly, shaped more by function than comfort. A single chimney, a rocking chair tipped on its side, and a half-mended fence leaning tiredly like it might collapse from memory alone. He gestured to the door, then stood. Aside, Clara walked past him, every step echoing louder than the last. Inside, the space was Spartan, swept but sparse. A cot, a stove, a bucket. A small tin cup rested on the windowsill, catching the last light of day like a holy relic. There, were no photographs, no clutter. Only a locket hung from a nail on the wall, its clasp broken, its chain tied in a knot. He set her bundle beside the cot and lit the stove with quiet practice. No flare, no flare-up. Then, without a word, he walked back out into the dusk and let the door fall shut behind him. Clara sat on the cot, removed her gloves and placed her hands on her lap. Her knuckles ached. Her chest did too, but in a different way. The kind of ache that comes when something bruised inside starts to remember what it was before it was broken. She unwrapped the locket, ran her thumb over the dent in its back. The shawl slipped from her shoulders. And for a long while, she just sat there, still as stone, until the stars finally found the courage to come out. Outside, the wind howled past the cabin like it had somewhere to go, but inside, at last, Clara did not. The morning after Clara arrived, a quiet wind swept over the ridge, carrying the smell of horses, rain-dried dust, and distant cedar smoke. Light slanted through the crooked window panes, scattering across the floor like a map of invisible places. The cabin held its breath, waiting to see if she would stay. She woke on a mattress stuffed with hay, wrapped in a quilt that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. The ceiling above her was low-beamed and stained with old leaks, the kind that had tried to seep through but gave up halfway. It was the kind of place where everything stood still unless you moved it, and even then, it didn't move far. Elias was already gone. His boots hadn't made a sound on the floorboards. His shadow hadn't touched the stairs, but by the stove sat a tin mug, still steaming, and beside it, folded with careful precision, a pale blue blanket. Not left on her bed, but outside the loft door, close enough to reach, far enough to respect. Clara descended the stairs slowly, one hand grazing the wall. She ran her fingers along the back of the old rocking chair near the hearth where the wood had been worn smooth by years of use. Not recent use, but long ago. There were no voices in the room, no ticking clock, just the quiet ping of the stovepipe cooling, like a heart trying to remember its rhythm. She sipped the coffee. It was bitter, strong, no sugar, no cream, just heat and truth. And it was the kindest thing anyone had made for her in a very long time. Outside, Elias moved like someone who had forgotten how to walk slow. He carried fence rails on one shoulder, mended the west post, rubbed liniment into the leg of a limping gelding. Not once did he look toward the house, but Clara watched him through the window, her arms folded across her chest, the shawl tucked tight. He didn't speak, but his hands did. They coaxed the horses gently, with a touch to the flank or a nod of the head. He never raised a whip, or shouted. And when one colt reared, startled by wind, Elias simply stood still, hand raised in calm, and the animal settled, trembling but safe. Behind the barn, a lone wooden cross stood crooked in the earth. Wildflowers grew beside it, the stubborn kind that came back year after year, no matter how dry the season. Clara watched him kneel there once, just before dusk, pressing his palm against the marker with a tenderness too sacred for words. He stayed like that for a long time. And when he stood again, something in his shoulders stayed bowed. At night, the wind returned. It slipped through the chinks in the wall, humming through the rafters, like an old hymn. No one remembered the words, too. Clara lay awake beneath the quilt, listening to the creak of the rocking chair downstairs as it moved with the breeze. No one sat in it, but it moved, back and forth, as if memory had weight. She dreamed in fragments, a kettle boiling over, a slamming door. Her late husband's voice, not shouting but worse, condescending, cold. You were never meant for more than quiet corners and second helpings, Clara. His words always lingered like smoke in a closed room. She'd once believed him, lived under his roof like a well-kept thing, until the debts came, until her name became currency. In the dream, she tried to run, but her boots sank in river mud. He stood on the bank, counting silver pieces. She woke sweating. The rocking chair below her creaked, and the stars blinked through the cracks in the loft roof like eyes that had seen everything. By the third morning, Clara had begun placing things, a tin basin by the door for washing, a sprig of sage on the windowsill. She swept the corners, rinsed out old jars, folded the second blanket on the cot downstairs. Elias never said a word, but once she found a sharpened knife set beside a bundle of carrots and a note scrawled in blocky letters. For stew. Not you make it, not please. Just, for stew. She peeled them slowly at the table that evening. When the pot began to boil, Elias came in, hung his coat on the hook and sat across from her. He didn't eat until she nodded. Didn't take seconds. Just placed his hat on the table between them and listened to the fire crackle. She found herself, speaking softly. My husband never let me cook unless guests were coming, she said. Said I only knew how to burn potatoes. Maybe I did. He didn't answer, but he pushed the empty bowl toward her, slowly, and then pointed to the pot. The steam between them curled like a smile neither of them quite knew how to wear. Late. One afternoon Clara ventured outside. The sky was wide and blue, not yet bruised with dusk. She followed the worn path past the corral, where Elias was tending the youngest colt. She didn't call out, just leaned on the fence and watched. He glanced at her, only once, and then offered a nod, just barely. She returned it, and in that moment, it was enough. That evening, she stood at the sink washing the cups. The window before her fogged with steam. Elias sat nearby, mending the strap of a saddle. The leather creaked softly under his hands. Did you love her? Clara asked, voice barely above the hiss of the boiling kettle. Elias didn't look up. Instead, he reached into his pocket, drew out a small locket, and placed it on the table. Inside, a lock of fine golden hair, faded, curled like a question mark, and a child's drawing folded into quarters. He did not weep. But something in the room fell quieter than silence. Clara didn't ask more. She simply poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. And in that house, without footsteps, 2 souls sat shoulder to shoulder, not speaking but no longer alone. The air that evening tasted like metal, the kind that rides in just before the world remembers how to break. The clouds rolled in slow, swollen and dark, their bellies dragging over the hills like old regrets. The light outside turned the color of worn brass, and even the birds fell silent, as if the sky had asked for quiet. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped in her shawl, staring out across the paddock. The horses were uneasy, tails flicking, hooves scraping, ears twitching toward a thunder they hadn't yet heard but somehow felt. Inside the barn, Elias moved without urgency, securing feed bins and halters with the grace of someone who'd done it in storms worse than this. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his hands steady as he checked each gate, one by one. Then the sky split. A crack of lightning tore across the clouds like someone had ripped the world's seam from end to end. A moment later, thunder bellowed down so hard it seemed to shake the bones in Clara's chest. The rain came suddenly. Not a drizzle, not a warning, but a downpour that slammed into the roof like judgment. The wind howled. The younger colt bolted first, a gangly thing, all legs and panic. 2 others followed, breaking through the flimsy outer gate and into the open. Elias! Clara called. The word ripped from her before she realized she'd spoken it. He was already running, coat abandoned, soaked within seconds. He moved through. The downpour like a ghost with purpose, arms out, trying to herd the panicked animals back toward the barn. Clara didn't think. She just ran. The mud sucked at her boots, rain stabbing at her cheeks. She slipped once, caught herself on a post and pushed forward. One of the mares reared nearby, hooves flashing white in the lightning. Clara flinched, but Elias stepped between them, his body calm even in chaos. Together they circled, guided, and coaxed the frightened horses back one by one. Clara waved her arms, whispered steady nothings, her breath fogging in the cold. Her braid came loose in the wind, strands plastering across her face. Her dress clung heavy to her legs, and then a sharp cry. She turned to see Elias stumble. A startled mare had backed into him, sending him into a corner post. He hit hard and crumpled into the mud. "Elias!" she shouted again, her voice ragged. She ran to him, knees splashing into the puddle where he'd fallen. His eyes were open, dazed. Blood trickled from a cut at his temple, red against the ash-colored mud. No, no, no. Clara breathed, fumbling for her shawl and pressing it to his wound. Her hands trembled. Don't close your eyes. Stay with me. Do you hear me? It was the first full sentence she had spoken aloud in weeks, and for the first time he looked at her, really looked. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. Just breath, shallow and stunned. Clara reached behind his neck, easing him upright. The rain pounded harder now, like the heavens had been holding something back until this very moment. They made it back to the cabin, one slow step at a time, her shoulder under his weight dragging like memory. By the time they reached the porch, she was shivering. By the time they reached the hearth, she was soaked through. She helped him sit on the cot and stoke the fire, fingers clumsy, hair dripping down her back. Steam hissed from their clothes as warmth returned. Clara poured water into a basin, gently wiped the blood from his face. He watched her, still silent, still unreadable. But when she reached for a dry cloth, he touched her wrist, light, but deliberate. He turned toward the shelf above the fireplace and gestured. A small silver locket sat there, its chain knotted and tarnished. Clara reached for it, her fingers brushing the metal that had long since lost its shine. She opened it. Inside, a lock of braided golden hair, and opposite, a child's drawing, a house, a man, a girl holding a flower. Clara's breath caught. Elias didn't move. He simply stared at the fire, his jaw tight. She didn't ask, didn't need to. The storm inside him had been raging much, longer than the one outside. She closed the locket gently and set it back where it had waited, undisturbed, for God knows how many years. Then she filled 2 mugs and handed him one. The fire crackled softly. The rocking chair swayed in the corner, creaking in rhythm with the rain on the roof. He lifted the mug to his lips. She mirrored him. They drank. Steam rose between them, swirling like a bridge made of breath and time. Her fingertips brushed the hem of her shawl, now stiff with dried blood and rain. She folded it carefully and set it beside the hearth. No words were spoken, but none were needed. 2 souls who had once drowned in silence now sat, side by side, letting the quiet hold them, not as prisoners but as witnesses to the same storm. Outside, the land drank the rain, and inside, so did 2 hearts, not to forget, but to begin again. Spring tiptoed in slowly, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The frost in the soil eased. The sagebrush began to green. And in the small stretch of land behind Elias's cabin, Clara knelt with bare hands in dark earth, coaxing new life from tired ground. It was the kind of work she used to do under command. Now she did it under sun, under choice, tomatoes, beans, a row of stubborn onions. She planted them all with reverence, humming under her breath, the tune only half remembered, but hers again. Inside. The house, the silence remained, but it had softened. Elias had built her a proper cot, not out of pity, out of intention. Each nail driven with care, the wood planed smooth so it wouldn't catch on her shawl. He didn't ask her to move downstairs. He simply placed it there beside the hearth, then returned to the porch and whittled a piece of driftwood into something that looked like a bird. The air between them had changed, no longer guarded, just quiet, as if each was waiting for the other to speak first, but neither minded the wait. One morning, Clara sat brushing out her hair, and without thinking, braided it. Not in haste, not out of habit, but gently, like memory. She looked at herself in the warped mirror and saw a woman who still held shape, still had breath, still could choose. That day, Elias left a folded kerchief beside her coffee mug. Pale yellow, no note. She wore it around her wrist while she gardened and said nothing. It was near sundown when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Clara looked up from the bean rows. A lone rider approached, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. Elias stood from the barn fence, his posture stiffening slightly. The man dismounted before the gate, broad shoulders, dust on his boots and a glint of smugness behind tired eyes. "Name's Doyle," he said, tipping his hat toward Clara without warmth. "We met at the auction." Clara didn't reply. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped back toward the porch. Doyle hooked his thumbs into his belt. "Heard you were up here. Town's been buzzin'. Folks say Vane went and bought himself a wife, though I didn't take him for the romantic sort." Elias said nothing. "I was the next bid, you know," Doyle continued, glancing at Clara like she was still up for barter. "Ain't no papers filed. Technically, she's still property of the estate. I came to finish what the law started." Elias moved then, slowly, steadily, and disappeared inside the cabin. Doyle chuckled under his breath. "Thought so." But then Elias re-emerged, a rifle resting across his forearm. He didn't lift it, didn't raise his voice. Just stood there, silent, the barrel glinting in the last of the sunlight. His eyes locked on Doyle with a quiet that cut deeper than sound. Clara stood still beside the rocking chair, her breath shallow, her hands cold despite the warmth in the air. Doyle's smirk faltered. "You gonna speak, Vane?" he asked, stepping forward. Elias didn't flinch. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of sage and storm-washed dust. Behind them, the rocking chair creaked once, then settled. Doyle spat in the dirt. "You can keep her for now." "But this ain't over," he said, mounting again. "Law don't care if you're mute or just stupid. I'll be back." He rode off, without another word. The moment lingered long after the sound of hooves faded. Clara stood unmoving, her braid brushing against her shoulder in the breeze. Elias didn't look at her. He simply lowered the rifle, turned, and returned it to its place behind the door. That night, she made stew. Not because it was expected, but because her hands needed something to do. The kettle bubbled. The lantern flickered low. She set 2 bowls on the table, sat down, and stared at her reflection in the spoon. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly, more to the room than to him. Elias sat across from her but didn't lift his eyes. He reached for the bread, tore it in half, and set one piece beside her bowl. She took it with both hands. After supper, Elias retreated to the porch, a tin cup in his hand. Clara stayed by the stove, wiping down the table with long, slow circles. When she finished, she stood at the window, watching him in silhouette. His shoulders hunched as if still bracing for a blow that hadn't come. She stepped outside. The stars had come out timidly, scattered like spilled salt across a blue-black sky. The air was cool but not cruel. "I didn't cry when my husband died," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Didn't even feel much. I just packed what was mine and walked out before his brother could take the house." Elias didn't move. But today, when Doyle showed up, I felt it, right here. She placed a hand over her chest. Fear, not of him, of leaving, of being something passed around again. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said. Elias didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, the yellow kerchief, and gently placed it back on her wrist. Then he went inside. She stood there a long time, listening to the frogs in the creek and the whistle of wind in the pines. The sky above her vast, her place beneath it quiet, but claimed. And though the world beyond the hills hadn't changed, something inside her had, and this time, it stayed. The wind that evening was soft, not cold, not restless. Just the kind that wandered in with the scent of sage and wood smoke and stayed a while, like a guest who meant no harm. Clara stirred the stew slowly, one hand on the spoon, the other absently brushing flour from her apron. The hearth crackled behind her, casting warm gold across the walls. Outside, the last light slipped behind the ridge, leaving the porch painted in blue shadow. From the corner window, she saw Elias hunched by the hitching post, wrestling with an old saddle. His shoulders strained as he tried to bend the cracked leather into shape. The strap kept slipping. His hands, though sure, had grown stiff. the kind of ache that came not from age, but from carrying too much, too long. She wiped her hands on a cloth, stepped outside. "Let me," she said quietly. He didn't argue. Just stepped aside, holding the worn strap in place while she threaded the buckle with practiced fingers. Their hands brushed. She expected him to flinch, maybe to step back like he always did. But he didn't. He stood still, close enough to feel the warmth of him through the cool dusk. She tied the strap, let her hands linger a second longer than needed. He looked at her, and for the first time, didn't look away. They said nothing. But something passed between them in that silence, something warmer than fire and older than longing. Later that night, the house settled around them like a blanket pulled up high. Clara sat in the wooden chair by the hearth, sewing a torn hem. The lamplight danced on her face, softening the lines carved by years and sorrow. She began to hum, not loudly, not for anyone else, just for herself. An old hymn from her mother's garden days. A tune with no words, only the memory of petals and church bells. Elias sat across from her, sharpening a blade with rhythmic, careful strokes. The sound slowed as he listened, then stopped. When she paused, he tapped his chest, twice, softly, just over the heart. More. She blinked, startled by the gesture's tenderness, so she hummed again, the melody looping gently, steady as a rocking chair on a quiet morning. When she finished, he leaned forward slightly. Clara set down her needle. Her hand reached across the table, unsure yet certain, and settled on his. His fingers didn't move at first. But then, slowly they turned under hers, rough palm to palm, and held. No confession, no promises, just touch, as quiet and sure as the ground beneath them. The next morning, the air was still and new. A faint mist hung over the grass like a secret not yet told. When Clara opened the loft door, she found it there, folded neatly on the railing. A dress, not new, but clean, mended with careful stitches. A soft brown calico with tiny blue flowers at the hem, and resting on top, 3 wildflowers picked fresh from near the creek. Not arranged, just placed with thought and simplicity. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it. She hadn't worn a dress like this since before her name was put on a ledger and traded like horse tack. Since before she learned that silence could be armor, and eye contact an invitation to harm. She pressed the fabric to her chest and closed her eyes. That evening, the stew simmered early. She laid out 2 plates without a second thought, adjusted the fork beside his with a gentle touch. She wore the dress, braided her hair, and tucked the yellow kerchief, his quiet gift from days ago, into the waist. Elias entered just as the sun left the sky, his face streaked with dust and salt. He paused when he saw her, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than usual. Not as a man claiming something, but as one recognizing something sacred. She pulled out the chair across from hers. He sat. They ate in silence, but it wasn't empty. The clink of spoon against bowl, the soft sigh of the fire, the way he passed her the bread before she asked. All of it spoke louder than words could carry. Halfway through the meal, he reached for the kettle and refilled her cup before his own. She looked up. "Thank you," she whispered. He met her eyes, and this time, he smiled, not with his mouth, but in that quiet shift behind the eyes, the kind that only those who've known deep sorrow can give to someone finding their way back. After dinner, they sat by the hearth, not across the room, but side by side. Clara rocked, gently, the hem of her dress brushing the floor. Elias sipped from his cup. She began to hum again, slower this time, fuller, and the tune lingered in the air like wood smoke and warmth. Outside, the wind didn't howl. It simply rustled the leaves as if nature itself had leaned in to listen. And in the quiet between them, something caught fire. Not wild, not sudden, but steady as morning light on worn floorboards. The morning began with a hush. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir, as though the hills themselves were waiting for something long overdue. The sky held its breath, cloudless and pale, and the cabin stood still in the golden light, casting no judgment, only presence. Elias saddled the horses with deliberate care. No urgency, no words. Just quiet rhythm, leather straps tightened, a boot on the stirrup, the weight of history settling into place. Clara emerged from the doorway. She wore the calico dress, the one with wildflowers stitched at the hem, the one he'd folded for her long ago and left like a question. Her braid was tight and neat, a ribbon of resolve down her back. She stepped into the saddle without help. Side by side they rode out. No dust kicked up, no gallop. Just two silhouettes crossing the valley as the sun rose higher behind them, two shadows stretching toward a reckoning. The town of Windermere hadn't changed. The same cracked boardwalks, the same tilted sign above the post office, the same boys loitering outside the general store with cheeks full of tobacco and eyes full of nothing. But something felt different as Clara and Elias dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Not louder, just heavier. Inside, the sheriff looked up from his desk, jaw tightening at the sight of Elias first, and Clara second. "Well," he said, clearing his throat. "Didn't expect to see you two in town again, especially not together." Clara stepped forward. She held a folded letter in her hand, creased, ink-smudged, written in Elias's slow, square script. The edges were worn from where she had read it again and again. She placed it on the desk along with a second paper, older, stamped, and yellowing with official ink. The bill of sale Doyle now claimed gave him rights to her name. "He's coming," Clara said. Her voice was even, unshaken. "With two others. He says the letter makes me his property again." The sheriff looked at her, then at Elias, then back at the papers. He said nothing for a moment, only scratched his temple with a long breath. "You know this ain't common practice," he muttered. "I know," she said, "but it's been common enough." Outside, the sound of hooves. Doyle rode in just as he promised, flanked by two men, one thin as barbed wire, the other broad and mean-eyed. They dismounted and strode up to the office with swagger and dust. "Well, now," Doyle called out, grin already forming. "Didn't expect you to come hand-deliver her back, Vane. Thought you'd be too busy playing house up in the hills." Clara stepped out of the doorway before Elias could. She met Doyle's eyes, head on, no tremble in her shoulders, no flinch. "I'm not yours," she said. "And I never was." Doyle laughed. "That right? You forget what was signed? I got the paper right." "I have my own," she cut in, lifting Elias's letter. Doyle's smirk cracked. "She's got a right to speak," the sheriff added from behind her. "And I've read what's written. It holds. She's a widow, and a woman." "She's a person," Elias said. His voice graveled, low and sudden. Everyone turned. It was the first time anyone in Windermere had heard him speak in nearly a decade. Doyle stared like he'd seen a ghost. Elias stepped forward, jaw firm, voice measured. "She's not yours. And she never was." Silence fell over the street like snow. Doyle's lip curled. He looked around for support, for someone to back him, but found none. The townsfolk had begun to gather, but no one moved to help him. No one even nodded. He spat in the dirt, climbed back on his horse, and left with nothing but the dust behind him. Clara didn't watch him go. She turned instead to Elias. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, there was no weight in his eyes. Only light, soft and cautious, but light all the same. They rode back in easy silence. The trail behind them swept clean by wind. That night, the cabin glowed warm again, not from fire alone, but from a peace newly claimed. No lawman's words, no man's mercy, just a hard-earned stillness where love could stretch and settle without permission. Clara stood at the door, as dusk fell. Her braid caught the breeze, lifting like a ribbon against the fading sky. She looked out toward the edge of the land, where the hills bled into stars. Then, slowly, she unbraided her hair. Strand by strand, she let it fall. Not as surrender, but as choice. Elias stood behind her, just inside the doorway. She turned, crossed the threshold, and placed a hand on his cheek. No words. Just presence. She rose on her toes and pressed a kiss, soft, certain, to the side of his face, where the sun had long kissed first. He closed his eyes. Not because he was afraid, but because he finally didn't need to keep them open to guard his heart. And in the hush that followed, beneath a sky full of nothing but stars, two people stood in a doorway neither would ever walk through alone again.